manufacturing. He's going to help us craft the policies that will create the next generation of great manufacturing jobs and ensure American competitiveness in the 21st century.
For more on the Czar controversy, I am joined by Republican Congressman Steve Scalise of Louisiana and Elizabeth Williamson, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Good morning, guys. Good to see you. Congressman Scalise, let me start with you. What were your concerns about Van Jones, and what does this say about the process of selecting as many czars as this administration has?
Well, first of all, I think that this whole idea of having over 30 czars, people that literally duplicate in some cases what some cabinet secretaries are supposed to do, it's a dangerous direction. I think if you look, the vetting process for Van Jones clearly did not exist. You don't have that same accountability and scrutiny as with the cabinet secretary, where they actually have to go through a Senate confirmation process. So I think the fact that this president's appointed over 30 of these czars, we've got to retreat back to what the founding fathers really intended, and I think we should get rid of the czars and actually have the people that are running these departments do their jobs and have people under them that are competent. Otherwise, why do you have these people that have to come and advise the president separately from someone who has the accountability and scrutiny of a cabinet secretary?
Elizabeth, this is the most fascinating story. You know the inner workings of Washington, D.C. better than anybody. They didn't have to go through a confirmation process. Now it feels as though the cracks are surfacing. How were these people vetted?
Well, Alexis, I think it's important to point out that this is a process. This appointing of czars of one kind or another with various policy job descriptions has gone back to the Nixon era. This is not a new thing with this administration. This is an historical development that probably the czars are more numerous with every administration, and this administration, as we've pointed out, has more than 30 of them. Normally, an appointee at this level would probably receive Senate confirmation, and that would involve, obviously, a hearing in which members of the Senate would be allowed to ask questions, and they do their own vetting procedure. But this is a situation in which the vetting is done by the White House itself, to greater or lesser degree.
It's interesting, Elizabeth, because I remember looking back in this story about 3-4 months ago when we were talking about the fact that it was so incredibly challenging for this president and this administration to get top advisors into the White House, which had to go through the confirmation process. I remember what it was like in the Treasury Department, and perhaps this was a way to go around it, to put top advisors around him who could provide him advice while the process of appointment or confirmation was taking so long. What does this say going forward?
Well, I think as we've had in the past, we've had situations come up in which individuals, whether it was a lobbying situation and they were granted a waiver, there have been very few of those, but there have been some. This was something that the White House was very concerned about, was lobbying in an individual's past, whether they'd lobbied on the policy area or for the industry that they would be regulating or developing policy for. Now I think that maybe the emphasis will shift somewhat with future appointees, because there are a number of positions in the cabinet and at the lower levels beneath cabinet level still to be filled. So it may be that there'll be a shift in vetting toward what has this individual done in their past, what organizations have they belonged to, what sort of public comments have they made.
It's very interesting, Congressman Scalise. I'm reading a report that I wrote on a blog because recently I appeared at the National Summit in Detroit at the Detroit Economic Club with Van Jones and Governor Granholm. I moderated a session with them. I have to admit, Congressman Scalise, I did not know about his background, but I wrote fairly lengthy about some of the things he suggested about the green economy, about the initiatives going on in China. He taught me, for example, that in China they're spending $12 million an hour on renewable energy. I was impressed. I didn't know the history here, but does this mean that you guys are going to want to scrutinize the rest of the czars even more closely?
Well, I think if somebody is advising the president on a regular basis on specific policy initiatives, that's somebody that we should all know about, know what their background is, just like they research the background of other high-level executives. House. And so, somehow he was able to completely bypass the scrutiny that existed. And really, I think it was the media that was able to go in and find out some of these really radical organizations that he had ties with, some of the kind of bizarre statements that he had made accusing President Bush of being involved in 9/11, things like that. That's not somebody you want to have a high-level advisor to the White House on policy, especially where you already have people in cabinet-level positions that went through the scrutiny that should be doing the same thing.
And finally, Elizabeth, the announcement came out at 12:01 over the weekend. It seems as though they tried to get as little scrutiny as possible. But why? What is it about the timing, and how important is this week for the president?
Well, I think this is one of the first times in which the conservative attacks on the president on matters of policy and appointments has really drawn decisive blood. I mean, this was something that, this criticism was directly responsible for this man resigning. And so this is not something that the administration really wants to highlight or play really big. And so that was why this announcement was made. I mean, you couldn't really pick a less auspicious time to announce the resignation of one of your officials. On the other hand, I do want to make the point that just because these folks aren't subject to Senate confirmation doesn't mean that members of Congress completely are immune or abdicate their responsibility to check these individuals out. I mean, the House Energy and Commerce Committee certainly has the ability to check the field of expertise in which this man was responsible. So to look into his background is something that it's not only the responsibility of the media, it's also the responsibility of members of Congress who work with these individuals on policy.
Excellent point. All right, we'll leave it there. Congressman Scalise and Elizabeth, thank you very much. We appreciate you joining us this morning.
Great to be with
Thanks,
you.
Alexis.
All right, well, Cadbury says Kraft's nearly $17 billion offer is too